Hello, good morning today. Our guest is Dr. Adam Perkins, and we're going to be discussing his fascinating book, The Welfare Trade. Hello, Dr. Perkins. How are you doing?
Hi, Lipton. I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm great. Your book is intriguing, and I'm sure our listeners are going to love it. So, Dr. Perkins, what is the welfare trade?
So, the welfare trait is an idea that there's a connection between personality and welfare benefit usage. And that might not seem obvious, but the connection is by employability. Uh, so, if someone happens to have a personality profile that is unreliable and uncooperative, that person is going to struggle to hold down a job, okay? Because on the rare occasions that they do turn up to work, their uncooperative tendencies will cause them to get into fights with customers, to be rude to their boss. And over time, over many millions of people, this kind of personality profile becomes overrepresented in the ranks of the unemployed. And in the UK, these people are entitled to welfare benefit payments, basically free money. Um, and what we do in the UK is we give these people extra money if they have extra children. So there's this perverse incentive for unreliable and uncooperative people who are the least competent people in the population to have extra children. Um, and personality generalizes across situations. So if someone is not conscientious enough and not cooperative enough to hold down a job, they're also not going to be a conscientious parent. Okay, so those children that have been born to allow their parents to earn extra cash from the welfare system, those children are going to suffer neglect because the same kind of people who don't work for a living also neglect their children. And personality, although it does have a heritable basis, there is a partly genetic basis for personality. It's also influenced by the environment. And if someone, through no fault of their own, is born into a abusive and brutal and chaotic home, it can damage their personality profile. Not in every case. I mean, I'm sure you probably know some people who've had a brutal, chaotic, abusive childhood, but they've turned out to be great. You know, you maybe met someone like that. You
Yes,
know,
one person.
and likewise, you probably maybe also met someone who comes from a conscientious, functional home with conscientious parents, but they still turn out to be highly dysfunctional and essentially unemployable. Um, some people
No,
say there's a member of the
I they
some
were
people say there's a
only
member of the
they were only dysfunctional when they were teenagers. But in
oh, okay.
adulthood, they are quite successful.
Yeah, well, we've had a case of a member of the royal family here. I won't name any names, but you know, who's been removed from the royal duties, and he might be an example of someone who's had a conscientious and privileged upbringing, has still turned out themselves to be dysfunctional. Okay, but the point is, these people are edge cases, and we should never base our analysis of a situation on edge cases. The way to think about it is David Licken's model. So he would argue that there's many genetic variants that influence our ability to become conscientious, well socialized people. Um, and so he would say that these genes are distributed in the population as a normal distribution, like the bell curve. Um, so you get some people, a few people out here on the right hand side of that distribution of genes for being well socialized, who they've got a very high dose. For some reason, they've just got lucky, right? So they've got a really high dose of genes for being easily socialized. So David Licken would argue that these people, even if they're born into a brutal, chaotic, dysfunctional household, if they just get a little nudge from maybe a teacher or maybe a sports coach or somebody like that, they can still come good and become a well socialized member of society. At the other end of the scale, according to Licken's model, there is people with a really low dose of genes for being easy to socialize. Yeah. So these are people who got unlucky. They, and even in a functional, conscientious household, they're still going to turn out to be unsocialized because of their genetic legacy. But these are the exceptions. Most of us, 68% of us, are in the middle, within one standard deviation of the mean. And 68% of us, therefore, get an average dose of genes for being easy to socialize. So most of us are kind of easily swayed kids. Yeah. So we just blow whichever way the wind goes. So if we land in a household that is functional and organized and conscientious, then we'll just follow that kind of pathway. If we happen to land in a household which is chaotic and brutal and abusive and neglectful, we will go that way. And so this is the whole argument. While there is a genetic basis, it's the final outcome is an interaction between the size of the dose of genes for being easy to socialize and the degree of chaotic, dysfunctional parenting that we get from our environment. That's David Licken's model. And in the book, I actually explain that a little bit. And I would broadly support that model because it does explain a wide range of people, all the way from the kids who came good despite a really tough upbringing, the kids who turned out to be dysfunctional even though they have a privileged upbringing, and then the rest of us who are in the middle. And this kind of contrasts with quite a lot of the literature. Have you read about twin studies and behavior genetics?
Yes, yes. So this
Yeah.
shows
Okay.
relative and intelligence.
Yeah. So what these twin studies show is that shared environment has no effect on personality. Okay. So they show that personality is roughly 40% heritable, and then 60% environmental. But what the twin studies show is that the environmental contribution to personality is almost completely from the unique environment. So that's not from your household you grew up in. That's from unique things that happened only to you. It didn't happen to your siblings. It didn't happen to your other people in your family. It's like being mugged or something like that, just a unique environmental event. But the problem with this is that twin studies tend to be done with middle-class families, okay? So David Licken, his phrase was, middle-class families are fungible, which he means interchangeable. So you could take a child and parachute them into any number of middle-class families, and they're going to get roughly the same kind of environment. They're going to have exposure to books, to computers, to musical instruments, to sport. What he would argue is that the environment in middle-class families is pretty even. Okay, there's plenty of opportunities for your genetic steersman to come out, but in disadvantaged families, the environment is uneven. So if you're dealing with highly dysfunctional, chaotic, brutal, abusive households, some of them still have musical instruments. Okay. So even in a really, really deprived household, the kid may well have exposure to musical instruments, right? But that's not typical. There's much more uneven distribution of resources. So what we're dealing with is the dysfunctional, chaotic, brutal families who actually do damage their children in terms of their personality development. The kind of people who do live on welfare, those families don't get into twin studies. Because if you're not very conscientious as a person, you're not really likely to volunteer your children to be in twin studies. It's a middle class thing. So although whilst in many households the shared environment doesn't really affect things in terms of your personality, when we come to the really challenging environments, the disadvantaged households, which are typically more concentrated in the welfare claiming part of the population, there's reason to believe that a brutal, neglectful, abusive, chaotic environment can damage the child's personality development. And so in the book, I talk about quite a large number of different randomized controlled trials of early intervention of preschool studies in which a population of disadvantaged children is identified, such as children born to 14-year-old mothers in a dysfunctional neighborhood. So those children are randomly split into two groups. So half the group, they get the same life they always had, and the other half, they get intensive preschool tutoring. So you may have heard about James Heckman, the famous Nobel laureate. So he's taken a big interest in these studies, the peri-preschool, the CARE study, these kind of randomized controlled trials have attracted quite a lot of attention because what they show is that if you backtrack a little, they were actually created to test for the outcomes of the Head Start program in the 60s, which the American government launched to try and boost the life outcomes of disadvantaged children.
which was
The
not
idea was it would,
successful.
well, it wasn't successful because they wanted to boost IQ, right? They wanted to boost cognitive ability, and as you no doubt know, IQ is almost totally heritable. It's about 80% heritable. There isn't much room for environment to influence IQ at all. It's almost completely inherited. So what they found was when they did these randomized controlled trials where a group of disadvantaged children was split into two subgroups, and one of them got this intensive preschool tutoring, the other didn't. They found there was an initial IQ bump in the treatment group, but that IQ bump didn't last. By the time the children got older, there was no significant difference in IQ between the two groups. But what they did find is that the treatment group had better life outcomes. So that was a mystery. If it's not, if the intensive preschool tutoring is not affecting the IQ scores of these children, what is it doing? You know, how is it? What is the active ingredient between this intensive caring preschool tutoring, between that and the better life outcomes when the people are 40 or 50 years old? And there is some evidence to show that the children who got the intensive preschool tutoring became more functional in terms of personality.
Yes.
So their personality profile just became more conscientious, more agreeable. They were better able to hold down a job. They were better able to avoid criminality. And this has caused a big controversy because many of these studies are very expensive to run. If you're providing intensive preschool tutoring for each child for 3 or 4 years at a very early age, that's expensive. So the sample sizes are small. So I think typically, if you look at these studies, the sample sizes for the two groups, the intensive preschool tutoring group and then the control group, are pretty small. They're maybe 60 children, something like this. They're not big groups of children. So statistically, the statistical power of the results is limited, and that's been a criticism. But on the other hand, there is seemingly a replicable element to these studies. So if you find studies with a relatively small sample size, but they are replicated in different locations by different research teams, then some people would say that's a sign that it's a real effect, possibly.
Dr. Perkins, is the welfare state aggravating dysfunctional personalities?
Well, that's a good question. That's the $1 million question, really. in the UK, we've got some evidence that it is. So there's been some work by Mike Brewer and colleagues who they subsequently got quite annoyed at my book, but they nevertheless did find some evidence that the more money that is paid to unemployed people, the more children they have. So there is some and relatively uncontroversial evidence of a link between welfare generosity and fertility. Okay, so in the UK, certainly we've got some hints. It's not conclusive, but there's some hints that the more money you give to unemployed people to have extra children, the more children they do have, which is fairly logical because people are rational agents. Um, if you offer people money for something, they're rationally going to take it in many cases. So what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't blame people for taking these choices, right? We're not trying to demonize unemployed people. What we're trying to do is demonize the system that sets up these perverse incentives. So if anyone's at fault, it's the fault of the civil servants and the politicians who've created a welfare state that rewards idleness and encourages the least competent people to have extra children.
Is welfare responsible for the erosion of social norms? In your book, you cited a snippet from a publication penned by James Heckman, and James Heckman was summarizing data. And in the snippet, James Heckman argues that welfare erodes social norms. And I've seen studies along this line.
Yeah, so again, that's another active ingredient that you could point to for generous welfare benefits eroding work ethic, for example. So people are it's kind of social learning, I guess you could call it, which is quite a rapid way that change can happen in a community. There's been studies in various different domains, and so if children grow up in households where the norm for their parents is to just get free money from the state without having to do any work, without having to go out to work, then you could argue that those children will learn dysfunctional norms. The norm that parents go out to work to provide for their children, which has historically been the case, that norm in certain households changes. So the norm is, why would you bother working? You're stupid to go out to work. You can get 40, 50, 60,000 pounds a year from doing nothing. So it's, and again, we can't really blame these people because if I was in, I mean, I've worked in laboring jobs. Okay, I've worked 2.5 years in a clothing warehouse doing quality control, right? Which is quite backbreaking. My hands used to bleed at the end of the day from the cardboard sucking out the moisture. But if I was still in that warehouse, if I had no opportunity to gravitate to other jobs, less physically backbreaking jobs, I can admit that I would give up work and I would just exploit the welfare system because it's there to be exploited. I didn't design it. It's created, and if I'm in a backbreaking laboring job and I could just quit and get a large amount of money just by having extra children, then why wouldn't you? It's a no-brainer. And we can't blame people for this. We need to have a better designed welfare system where there is no option to just quit work and live idly. We have to have what Australia would call
Workfare?
mutual well, in Australia they call it mutual contribution. So they've had and in the States I think it's called workfare. So essentially unemployed people will get welfare benefits in Australia, but they will be required to do a certain amount of hours per week in some kind of work, like I don't know, sorting, recycling, for example. So doing 30 hours a week, sorting, recycling with a magnet, with cans like steel, aluminium, steel, this kind of thing. So it turns out that this approach to the welfare state is highly effective because people value time. So you have to drop the generosity of welfare benefits really low before people are willing to give up their free time to join the rat race and to drag themselves off to work in a warehouse at 6 a.m. every morning. The financial difference between the two situations of working and being idle has to be enormous before people will give up idleness. Because it's nice to be your own boss, right? To have your own free time, nobody shouting at you, no abusive employers. That's quite pleasant. So where the Australians are so clever is they've realized this. So by requiring mutual contribution, by requiring people to do some kind of community work in return for their welfare benefits, they're saying, we will look after you. If you're having a hard time, the state will pay money to look after you, but in return, you have to give up your time, such as 30 hours a week. Um, and what that does is it smokes out people who are working secretly, who've got this kind of secret black market job, and they're claiming benefits while secretly working. But also, it just forces people to give up their free time, and it's the free time that's extremely valuable. Like I think Napoleon said, "Ask of me anything but time." So people really value free time. So the genius of the Australian system is it takes time out of the equation. By forcing people to turn up at a work center for, let's say, 30 hours a week, and then they have another 10 hours or so a week that they can do job seeking. The Australians have very cleverly changed the incentive balance. So the UK could certainly do that. And if you read the original blueprint for the welfare state in the UK, which was the William Beveridge
Beverage.
report
Yeah.
in 1942. So if you read that carefully, he advocated workfare. He advised workfare. He said words to the effect that men or women should not be allowed to claim welfare benefits for longer than 6 months without doing work or training. So he knew, even back in 1942, before the UK welfare state was created, the planner of the welfare state was already on the ball. He already understood the importance of free time. So he knew you could not give people free money if you also allowed them to keep their free time, because then the system would be exploited. And interestingly, he said for young people, you should have no free money at all. He said, if someone is under a certain age, say under 21, they should have no free benefits at all. They should be required from day one to attend training or work. Okay, so Beveridge knew what was going on, and unfortunately, when the UK government introduced the welfare state after World War II, they didn't implement the really important bit, which is what Beveridge had recommended for workfare. Because workfare is difficult to do. It requires a lot of determination from the politicians. They have to be seen as nasty ogres who are taking away people's free time. So the successive UK governments, Conservative and Labour, left and right, have dropped the ball on the welfare state, and they have let down the people. Not just the unemployed people by allowing them to be idle,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
also the workers who are paying taxes to pay for the unemployment system.
Yes.
Um,
Dr.
it's a
Perkins,
tragic shame.
I read the criticisms of your research. So Mike Brewer accused you of mischaracterizing data because he's arguing that some couples who were in relationships, they benefited from the increment of the welfare program, and these couples were working. Therefore, based on design of the program, they had an incentive to have more children over the lone mothers who were less likely to be employed. They did not have such an incentive. Therefore, even if you are inaccurate, your thesis is reinforcing the argument that welfare promotes reproduction because both groups are working class groups. They're relatively poorer groups. And if the lone woman had an incentive to reproduce, they would have had more children. So if the program had been designed to maximize the earning capacity of single women on welfare, these women would be reproducing more effectively. And that's where the Jonathan, the other professor who criticized your work, is interesting that he cites a link with you as an author. So you are pointing out the errors in the studies, which are not super serious errors because I read that response.
Yeah. Yeah.
So on
Yeah,
this
that's
show,
right.
we like to interrogate the critics. I am not afraid of debate, but my
Yeah, well,
fans,
I
they
mean,
like it when the authors speak more. That's why I'm so silent. But another point, Finland tested the UBI study and the results were not favorable at all. Universal basic income.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. As you say, Finland did try out universal basic income, which is basically giving free money to everybody, and they found that it was a disaster. Really, it didn't help to get people off unemployment. In fact, it seemed to go the other way. So it just encouraged idleness, which is to be expected. Again, time and time again, I'm saying we can't blame people for behaving rationally. Yeah. If I was stuck in a backbreaking laboring job for more than 2.5 years, I would just do the same, right? I'm not setting myself up as some kind of saint. Um, I would be happy to exploit the welfare system as much as I could if it saved me from getting up at 6 every morning and breaking my back all day with lifting heavy boxes. You know, that's a tough job. Um, but if the welfare system was changed so that you had to do workfare, um, maybe I would stick at my job, you know. But yeah, there's been a lot of criticism. The fundamental point about this criticism, I don't know if are you familiar with the idea of the blank slate?
Yes, which is not
Yeah.
a real theory. It is
No, I know. That's
plagiarism.
right. It's the sort of fundamental foundation stone of the modern left wing ideology, basically. So it posits that um, everybody is equally genetically talented at everything.
No.
Like, I mean, this is literally what we're seeing. We've got these kind of ludicrous blank slate arguments where they'll look at the wonderful achievements of someone, and they'll say, you know, this is nothing to do with their innate abilities. It's all to do with the environment. So in other words, if you train me, if you train me for in nuclear physics, I could become Albert Einstein.
Not
You
at
know,
all.
like
The
like you
10,000
could
the 10,000
you could
hour rule is fake.
it's
If you
fake.
practice
Exactly,
for
it's fake.
10,000 hours, you will not be Bill Gates. That was refuted, even by God.
Exactly. Exactly. So what we have in the modern world is we have a war, right? There is currently a war going on in Western civilization between reality and the blank slate. Okay, and the blank slate is supported by the left because it gives like feel good vibes, right? So the the idea that everybody's the same, we're all genetically equally talented at everything. It's got a feel good quality to it, yeah. Um, but it's not supported by reality, as you've said. There's multiple research findings showing that it's false. Um, but what I didn't realize is before I published the book, um, I didn't have a political profile. Like I'd never been I'd never been a member of a political party or anything like this. I just sort of beavered away in my own little niche doing personality research, like an egghead. You know, I'm literally and metaphorically an egghead, right? So I just sort of beavered away in my own little niche, publishing research findings on personality. Um, fine. And then when I went public and published this, I found myself crash landing into the middle of this culture war, this gigantic war between reality and the blank slate, right? Um, which I hadn't even thought about prior to publishing the book. I wasn't involved politically, um, and what I didn't realize is that in the UK, the media kind of elite establishment is very much invested in the blank slate. They believe in the blank slate. The BBC, the Guardian, academics, they're overwhelmingly left wing. And so these guys are engaged in a kind of an endless game of whack-a-mole. You know, the cartoon game where you're playing the game and the moles come up and you whack them.
Yes.
So these leftists are kind of stuck in, they're trapped in this. Every time reality contradicts the blank slate, they have to silence those people, um, because as soon as reality hits the blank slate, you get a disaster. It collapses. Um, so the most famous critic was Jonathan Portis, who's a professor of economics at King's College, London. Um, and he spent months critiquing my book in public. And then he admitted he hadn't read my book. so, so the the blank slate advocates are so detached from reality. They not only ignore reality in terms of ability. Like I could never become Albert Einstein. Like I know this, they know this. Everybody knows this, right? If I was smart enough to be Albert Einstein, I would be Albert Einstein. But I'm not smart enough. So anyway, so Jonathan spent many months critiquing my book and claiming he'd found basic data errors in it. But he couldn't actually say like, hey, Jonathan, which page is the error on? Because he didn't know, because he hadn't read it. So then he got really angry. And so what he then did, he went through past papers, so scientific papers I'd published, and then he looking for typos, and he found a paper with some typos, and then he secretly contacted the journal editor to demand the paper was retracted. But he made sure that his name was kept secret, so he was kept confidential. So he secretly said this paper should be retracted, but he didn't do it publicly so that people could assess his claims, because typos in a paper, there's proofreading, right? So when you do a paper, you proofread it, and they pick up typos and they get corrected. And this wasn't proofread properly. I admit it. It was a rush job. But he wasn't trying to get the paper retracted for the typos. He was trying to get the paper retracted because he claimed the statistics used were inappropriate. He claimed that the study should have used non-parametric statistics. Do you know much about statistics?
If I know, you can a bit, a bit. I'm not an expert like
Yeah,
psychologist, but if
yeah.
you read personally, I think that if you are in the podcasting business, you should be familiar with quantitative metrics, regression analysis, and the
Mm.
various techniques that people
Yeah.
use.
So basically, he claimed that the particular form of the data meant that it was more suitable to use non-parametric statistical testing rather than parametric statistical testing. And this was a reason to retract the paper. But unfortunately for Jonathan, the journal had their own statistical expert. so they looked into these claims and ran some non-parametric testing, and it turned out the results were significant non-parametrically as well as parametrically. So as a result, they rejected Jonathan's claim as false, and they refused to retract the paper. They corrected the typos, but they refused to retract the paper. And then Jonathan wrote a magazine article for New Statesman. Have you heard of New
Yes,
Statesman?
yes,
Yeah,
I've read New Statesman. I yes,
it's a famous it's a
the left-leaning
famous
publication.
it's a famous communist left-wing publication. It supported Stalin, for example.
Like
That's
the
the
New
kind of
York Times.
magazine it is. Stalin is good. They kind of love Stalin. And so, surprise, surprise, they published Jonathan's claim that this paper should have been retracted because it used inappropriate statistical procedures. But that's false because the journal has already published the corrigendum, and that corrigendum showed that Jonathan's claim was false. So you could ask the New Statesman whether they're going to correct that article if you want.
Okay, but I find, Dr. Perkins, I find it. Do you watch this show? Have you ever watched this show before?
I've seen a few clips. Have you got a YouTube channel?
Yeah, this is will be posted on YouTube.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I've
So
seen
I'm
some of your clips.
asking
Yeah.
because on this show I prefer for my guests to speak because there's some grumpy people who are complaining that I'm a bit loquacious. I don't share that view ever. But in this conversation, you have been asking me questions like, do you know the New Statesman? Do you know X type of statistics? Which I find quite funny because this is an academic show. So I don't know about other YouTubers, but I've read basically most of the important contemporary and classical studies on several topics. And I used to read the New Statesman, the Independent. But these days, I primarily the IEA. I cut off the left-wing media when it went woke. So Pacific Standard was a really good publication in the States, but it went woke, so I had to dump it.
Yeah. The ironic thing is, I mean, one thing to get across to your viewers is that the the left wing intelligentsia, the people who are pushing the blank slate, right? They themselves don't believe it. So
No,
they're pushing this idea, but in their own private life, they don't actually believe it. So they make sure to live in non-diverse areas, right? This is
yes.
the famous joke, leftists are like diversity for thee, but not for me.
Luxury
And
belief. So
and
leftists, they're educated. They select for socially adept partners. They get married and they usually stay married for a long time, but they don't have a problem with working class people having children out of wedlock. So
yeah.
Wilcox was in a class and he found it amusing that his students had no problem with fornication or early pregnancies, but they would not get pregnant early because they're upper middle class.
Yeah, so these people,
But
the
Dr.
left.
Perkins, I'm going to send you a second link because I'm on the free Zoom for now.
Okay.
So yes, I have some interesting points in part two.